Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Philip Cohen. He's Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland. He writes about demographic trends, family structure, the division of labor, health disparities, and open science. And today we're discussing whether generation labels make sense. I mean, labels like the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, whether it makes sense to talk about generations in that way. So, Philip, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for having me. I look forward to it.
So, just to introduce the topic, and perhaps for people who might not be very familiar with it, what is a generation label, and particularly researchers who use generation labels? What do they usually mean by the word generation?
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way because they're used less by researchers and more by journalists,
Mm,
people in marketing and business. So you can tell I'm already critical by the way I say that. Um,
yeah.
what they're trying to capture is in the best case scenario, what they're trying to capture is a collective experience that people have by virtue of being born in a common era, essentially, a period of some kind. And they may be called generations because they are in the realm of the length of a human generation. That is, they're not a minute or a week or a single year. They're something like 15 or 20 years. It varies depending on who is using the terms. But when you're talking in that range of a period, all the people born in a period of, say, 20 years, it's sort of like using the word decade. It's like a period that is of a recognizable length. They don't really match the length of human generations, but the idea is to capture the common experience of people who lived through history at the same time, at the same age. So that's powerful. Indicates having a certain amount in common in your life.
And what would be the length of a human generation?
Well, it totally depends. I mean, some people have children when they're 12 and some people have
Mhm.
children when they're 52. So you have
Yeah.
you can have a 12-year generation span or a 50-year generation span. There's an average, but I think it makes sense to speak of generations in family terms, in the sense that I am a third generation immigrant. That is, my
Mhm.
grandparents were immigrants to my
Right.
country. So in that sense, it's not a measure of years, it's a measure literally of generations within a family.
Right.
And so in that case, you can look at the average, like what is the average age of mothers or fathers when they have children, and it would be somewhere in the 20s or 30s in developed societies today. So you could think of the length in those terms.
Mhm. But you mentioned there that, of course, these generation labels that some people use do not correspond to the average
Right.
reproductive generation in humans. So is that a problem? I mean, and in what ways could it be a problem?
That's not a fundamental problem. I think the
Mhm.
reason they have sort of in the popular usage where we talk about silent baby boom,
Mhm.
millennial, Gen X, millennial, Generation Z, Alpha, or whatever we're up to now. In that popular usage, they have gotten shorter. In that the baby boom generation, such as called generation, the baby boom was an 18-year period, 1946 to 1964 in the United States, at least. But since then they've gotten shorter, and it's reasonable in the sense that the popular attention span has gotten shorter, and that's not an insult. That also means that things change more rapidly, mostly because of technology. So,
Mhm.
for example, you can talk about the different generations of the iPhone. It's a seventh generation or some other piece of technology or Wi-Fi. We've used 5G for internet. That's like a new generation in the technological terms. And so it's generational in the sense that it's a new period and it replaces the previous one, or the previous one becomes older and out of date, like human generations. Those can be any length. iPhone can come out with a new model 10 times a year if they want to, or their operating system. So if our experiences are determined by these technological forces, like, we can talk about things that have shaped current young people, like the introduction of the like button on Facebook or Instagram, or the introduction of short video services like Vine or TikTok. These things have happened in rapid succession and really changed the dynamics of teenage life, basically. So you might think about things that are like generations but are shorter, but in real human terms, in reproductive terms, our generations are getting longer because the age at childbirth is rising. So they're kind of going in opposite directions.
And how do they determine the division between generations? I mean, does it have any scientific basis, or it's simply arbitrary? And if it's arbitrary, I mean, are there any specific criteria that people use, or?
Basically, no. And that's really my main criticism of the whole concept is that if you're going to use categories in science, or social science, you have to use categories. That's a key, it's always been a central feature of science, is creating categories out of chaos. If you're going to create categories, you have to have a reason, and there is no reason for the division between, say, Generation X and Millennial. I mean, I like to use the example of Venus and Serena Williams, where Venus, the older sister, is Generation X and Serena is Millennial, and they're 1 year apart. So it does not make any sense at all to discuss those siblings who grew up so close in the same social milieu as being from different generations. They're in the same generation in their family, the same generation in society. It's nonsensical. But what's essentially happened is that it's become a competitive process, like in the world of marketing and business, where if you can announce a new generation and get the label to stick and become a viral concept, then you win, and then you can sell books or other products. So it's a little. It's my major criticism is that there is no reason for the lines drawn between the generations. And for that reason, you really should not. I mean, I could elaborate on that, but one thing that we use arbitrary definitions all the time. For example, years. Well, years have a basis in the solar system. It's not crazy, but in some cases we use years just because data is arranged that way. We may use hours, weeks, but it's if you're going to use some arbitrary definition, you have to explain this is arbitrary and we're using it for convenience. Decades. I use decades all the time in my research as a first pass through the data. But as a demographer, we use age all the time. Age is very important. How old are people? And we tend to use specific ages when it really matters, such as if I'm talking about births, women having births, I'll put women age 15 to 18 in one category. 18 is the age of majority, at least in the US, a legal majority. And then 18 to 24, that's kind of getting most people through the college years. And then after that, just 5-year blocks, 24 to 29, 30 to 34. And to be clear, it's arbitrary. We're grouping people just for convenience. If the generations were treated that way, it would make more sense. But once you create categories, give them names, and fix their boundaries without any basis in reality, then you're really at risk of creating false reality.
And isn't it the case that also these labels that are used sometimes worldwide, like baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, are mostly or apply mostly to the US. I mean, because, for example, just to give an example, the baby boom phenomenon didn't happen even in my own country, Portugal. I mean, because we didn't participate, at least directly, in World War II, we didn't have casualties like other countries had. And so back in the 50s, 60s, we didn't really have a baby boom here. So doesn't it apply mostly to the US and perhaps a few other countries?
Yes, well, it is definitely it's in that sense, it's an instrument of cultural hegemony, or imperialism is not reasonable from the point of view of science at all.
Mhm.
Um, the baby boom, a lot of countries had something like a baby boom after the war.
Mhm. Yes.
Apologize for that noise, by the way, that's my rabbit. I don't know if you can hear that noise. Um, the baby boom in the United States began in 1946, not just in 1946, in July of 1946, which really has to do with the timing of the soldiers coming home from the war. There was a huge increase in births, and it wasn't until 1964 that they went back below that birth rate. So that's a distinct period. Countries that didn't have a baby boom, there's no reason to talk about the baby boom as a generation, although they still lived in that world. It was a
Yes.
post-war world, and they may have things in common. It was the beginning of the Cold War. Like, if you have a specific reason to group people, that it's always, it can always be useful to do that, but you need to have a reason to do that. For example, September 11th, the attacks of September 11th in the United States changed our government's posture towards Islam and terrorism and global relations in ways that did affect other countries also. But other countries had major terrorist attacks that changed their perspective. And so altogether, that is sort of an era. But to start it on a certain date or something, it's worse than arbitrary. You're right, because it's specifically from the dominant perspective. And one of the problems with the stereotyping of generations is also the dominant group within that. When people say, "Oh, millennials," millennials like avocado toast, or they spend too much money on coffee. There's a class and race bias in that perception of the group. If you're going to define the whole generation, well, obviously, millennials in Gaza don't have the same issue, right? So it's there's a risk of not just collapsing reality, but collapsing it around the dominant perspective.
And since I just mentioned the baby boomers, do you think that at least perhaps a few generations that people identify as such it would make sense to group people in that way? Because, for example, the baby boom period, they represent a distinct demographic event, right? So at least do you think that that generation, it makes sense to talk about it that way and to group people from 1946 up to 1964 together, or not?
It's a reasonable hypothesis that they have things in common, and we know that some things they do. For
Mhm.
example, when there was a huge increase in the number of children, it created crowding in schools. It created certain conditions. It created a marriage squeeze because men like to marry women who are a few years younger. So when there's a huge increase in birth rates, all of a sudden you have a group of men who have not enough women a few years younger. So it's a squeeze for men, or it's a benefit, I suppose, for women if they're straight and looking for older men. Um, yeah, there's a commonality to the experience of the baby boom.
Mhm.
And the fact that the baby boom was 18 years long, may be why we got off on this whole generation thing in a way, because it was about the length of a generation. And when it was over, people sort of started looking for something to call the next group of people. And it took a few years for that narrative to emerge, but eventually it did. And the idea of Generation X was sort of like, it was X because it was a forgotten generation. It was in the shadow of the baby boom. It was a smaller group. And so there was a logic to the initial rollout of these concepts, not like anybody sat down and planned it, but it emerged culturally with some cultural logic. But you have to be careful. I mean, the baby boom did not have one experience on a lot of dimensions, at least in the US. The early baby boom, if you were born in 1946, you had a much higher chance of serving in the Vietnam War than if you were born in 1964. The early versus the late baby boom. By the time the late baby boom was growing up, it was a different world from the early baby boom. So, in fact, one of the things that really defines the baby boom is how much life changed for them. If you look at women's rights, women's employment, and education levels, the difference between 46 and 64 is totally transformative. They shared one common demographic event, but it's sort of like, like I say, September 11th, people experience that moment, but you have to really look at how did that change life forever after that? Did it change people? If we talk about the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, did that change? How did that affect people in early elementary school versus people in high school? They were all kids during the pandemic, but graduating in 2020, entering the labor market is very different from entering first grade in 2020, right?
Yeah. And do we know if people even identify themselves with their own supposed generation? I mean, like, for example, if someone was born in 1986, 87, and they look at someone born in 1990 and they say, oh, I don't have anything in common with this person. I mean, I would imagine that phenomenon would be very common, right? And then perhaps some of that also has to do with the stereotypes we attach to each generation. Perhaps someone from 1986 wouldn't want to be grouped together with someone who has particular stereotypes from the 1990s attached to them. Right.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think, as the terms have become common, most, but by no means all people, if you give them a list of generation names, can pick the one that they're supposed to be part of. Although when you get near the edges, the accuracy declines quite a bit. There's a good paper by Andrew Lindner and colleagues about this, where people who are in the middle of their generation are pretty good in their generation according to the Pew Research categories, which is a common framing. But one of the things is when you say people don't identify or do identify, it has to do with youth. And so there's a sense in which these generations really become vehicles for the age-old problem of kids these days. So it's always older people talking about younger people. And, so people say, oh, I'm a college professor. People say, oh, my students today, they don't know, they don't read books or something like that. And so instead of saying kids these days don't read books, they'll say Generation Z doesn't read books. And it's not really they should be speaking about, that is, we don't really know if that same group will not read books when they're 40, in the same way that millennials, read books when they're 40, right? So it becomes kids these days. The stereotype attaches to them, and then in a way they live the rest of their lives in the shadow of that stereotype. And so there is a way that people, and it frustrates me that people spend a lot of time and energy worrying about the stereotype. Oh, they say I'm a millennial, but I feel more like I'm Generation X, or I'm a late millennial because I don't own a house, so I'm more like Generation Z or something. And so this constant churning and worrying and debating and arguing about whether or not people belong in these categories, which are really quite pointless. So it's life, but it's frustrating sometimes.
And do you think that naming generations or using generation labels might promote pseudoscience? And if so, in what ways?
Well, I think yes. It's not necessarily super harmful. If you put the alphabetizing the labels is probably helpful. Although, like I said, Generation X had a specific meaning. Like, we didn't start with Generation A, right? We started with Generation X because it was sort of the invisible or the absent or the neglected. So it's not totally benign, but if you name them like the greatest generation, the silent generation, like, you can think of really very silent members of the silent generation like Martin Luther King, or not very silent. There is, I think it just promotes, you know, if you do research and you identify characteristics of a group and you can put some boundaries around it and they fit some model, then go ahead and give it an appropriate name. But I would not, based on some marketing or consumer behavior or a particular piece of technology or the internet or something like that, identify an entire group and assume that others that the commonality of their experience on this one thing, like did they have iPhones, extends to the other aspects of their life, like their labor market experience or their marriage or family outcomes, right? So where it becomes pseudoscience is when you use the category without empirical justification based on, either based on nothing or based on one facet of their lives without, critically thinking about whether it applies to other aspects of their lives.
So walk us through perhaps some of the main stereotypes that people tend to attach to each generation, from the silent generation through baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. What are some of the most common stereotypes associated with each of them?
That's actually pretty difficult. If you look at the common popular lists of stereotypes, it's a little bit like astrology in that they may be self-centered but altruistic. They may be lazy but extremely dedicated to certain issues. But there certainly are. I mean, if you look at the transition over time, they've become more associated with particular technologies, especially digital technologies. The baby boom generation had a reputation for being for driving social change, in terms of like protesting the Vietnam War and women's rights and civil rights, and then at some point the stereotype of them flipped and they became old lazy liberals who don't really think critically anymore, if you think of like Bill Clinton. So they're not stable in that way, but it is the case that millennials are perceived as having had a hard life because of the timing of the Great Recession and then the pandemic. So like they've had early adulthood and middle adulthood have been challenged by these serious events. And they have their own sets of neuroses and so on that came from that. Generation Z is living in this period of anxiety, and this is the Jonathan Haidt version from about how social media is ruining their lives and their mental health. And there is, these things are not crazy. They're not unrelated to experience, but I don't even like to get very specific about what they're supposed to be like. But maybe you're planning to get to this, so tell me if I should talk about this later. But the concept of cohort and life course experience is very important and very real. The age at which you experience historical events really matters. So what in demography we call age, period, and cohort. You're 5 years old at the moment that a certain historical event happens, and you have that in common with other people who are that age at that time, that historical moment. So this is a very important insight. If you were 12 years old in 2005 versus 12 years old in 2015, that second group had social media in middle school, and it changed it may have changed their lives forever. If you entered the labor market during the pandemic, you may earn less for the rest of your life because the first job you took was not advantageous versus entering during a boom year. So there are ways in which that it's important to think about the age at which you encounter historical moments, and how that casts a shadow or has momentum through people's entire lives. So anything bad I say about generation concepts should not be taken to undermine the powerful insight of what we call life course theory, or the idea that the timing of events affects everything that comes after.
And since you introduced the topic already, the topic of cohort and life course research, do you think that generation labels might also affect it in any way?
Well, I think they muddy the waters.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, one reason that they are so powerful and they have such currency in the culture, I think, is because they capture this insight. So it's a give and take. I think if you see most serious researchers, the vast majority of serious researchers would not use these generation categories, and especially not with their labels. And if you think about the terms, the baby boom is 18 years, millennials are like 16 years. I don't
Mhm.
know. Generation Z is maybe only 14 years, and they're changing, but the lines are arbitrary. So we had a campaign a few years ago of demographers and other social scientists, and we wrote to the Pew Research Center and we said, we beg you to stop framing all of your research in terms of generation
Mhm.
labels. And they had been doing that in a way and they're very effective science communicators and they do really important research. And their stuff was very important. They did subsequently change their practice and they now only describe people in generational terms when they have sort of generational data. That is, if you're doing a survey today of people by age and you say, oh, look, 60-year-olds are more likely to have been divorced than 30-year-olds or something like that, or more likely to get their news from print media. You should not describe that in generational terms
Mhm.
unless you have some longitudinal sense that the characteristics of that cohort adhere to them over time. If you're just doing a survey today and you say old people read the newspaper and young people get their news from TikTok, that's age. That's not necessarily cohort,
Yeah.
right? So that distinction is very important. It becomes a cohort effect or a cohort phenomenon when that carries with them through their lives or has some effect over the course of their lives. So forcing things into the generational frame can limit your ability to understand the phenomena you're actually looking at, I guess is one way to put it.
Right. And how should cohorts then be delineated? I mean, in terms of time periods, how do you look at it?
Yeah. Well, our data usually comes in years,
Mhm.
and like I said, years have a basis in the solar calendar. It's not you could use a lunar calendar, but solar calendar makes more sense for our seasons. And so I start by putting people in years. And we can see, for example, children born in January are different from children born in December because of the way society organizes itself in calendar years.
Right.
So that can be important. Okay. But if you look at years 70, 71, 72, okay. In fact, even the baby boom, like I said, it started in July of 1946. But maybe if you put everybody born in 1946 together, they probably had a similar experience because they all started school the same year, even though the ones born in May weren't really part of the baby boom, right? So the calendar is a
Mhm.
very powerful thing. Okay, years are pretty good. If you're going to start grouping them and trying to define eras and periods, I would start with something that's deliberately arbitrary and clearly arbitrary, like decades. And so, let's just put them in groups of 10 years and see. But if you have, and then you'll see people say things like, well, the 70s didn't really end until 1982. They'll say
Mhm.
based on fashion or music or something like that. And the 60s, the 60s really started with the first Rolling Stones concert in 1962 or something, whatever. I'm making these up. So then you can start to see that people start manipulating the categories. Maybe a demographer starts with decades, but you start thinking critically and socially, and you start to see that maybe the events you're looking at don't line up that way. And I think what you learn from that is that it depends on the question you're asking. So I would start with decades just to look at the trend over a long period of time. But as soon as I have a specific question in mind, how did September 11th affect the odds of volunteering to serve in the military? How did the Great Recession of 2009 affect home ownership? Then you can start putting dates around it, and look at the particular thing that you're studying. I'm studying home ownership. I'm going to pay a lot of attention to 2008, 2009 in the United States. If I'm studying public health and career choices of young people, I'm going to look at the pandemic. Um, but that comes from the research. It doesn't precede the research. as a settled question. So it really has to be handled theoretically and empirically, not predetermined. I mean, that's the way science should work.
And also looking at people that are supposedly part of the same generation, isn't it also the case that we should look into other aspects like their sociological aspects that affect their own life? For example, if people are part of different socioeconomic strata, I would imagine that they have very different life experiences and they go through life in many different ways. So aren't there are other factors that we should look into apart from the specific year or the specific period they might have been born in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth, like when we talk about age period and cohort, the thing about period effects is there's sort of things that affect everybody, right? So a recession, everybody lives in a recession. And of course, the recession doesn't bother Elon Musk in the same way that it bothers a poor person. But they're still living, they're both living in it, right? So you can look at that as a common experience, but then you have to think about, okay, how does this affect them differently? So one of the risks, like we said before, of collapsing is that you end up looking at the dominant category in the group, and missing others. But like you say, it's also about essentially different variables. So race and gender, nationality, and socioeconomic status may matter more than the cohort that you're born into for particular questions. Another thing that happens is because, and this is probably changing over time, because of our global and digital culture, the idea of one age group having a unique experience separate from another one is less the case than it used to be. That is, I use TikTok. I'm old, right? I don't use it well. I'm not like, but I look at TikTok. I make videos of like my pets and put them on TikTok. Like there's no world where a young person lives in a TikTok world and an old person completely does not. And so, especially around the edges, if you look at, one of the things that has happened is that the life course, the sequence of events in the life course, like what we call emerging adulthood, or something where you school, career, marriage, children, or whatever sequence. I say whatever because the sequence has become a lot more variable. These things have become less rigidly ordered than they were, at least at one period in history, and also more variable in terms of the length of these periods. We talk about delayed adulthood or something. It's no longer really the case, at least in the US, that people can be reliably said to have, that you stop measuring their education level at age 25. Right. It used to be the Census Bureau in the US publishes all their statistics on education for people age 25 and older, assuming they're done. Well, that's not the case anymore. And I know they know that, but that's a traditional category is 25 plus to look at completed education. Or for fertility and birth rates, it used to be 39. Above 39, we're not going to even measure fertility because women don't have babies after age 40. Well, now it's like, well, how about 49? The fact that the sequences have become less rigid and the periods have become more dispersed and more variable in terms of their length, means the very idea of fixing categories around them has become harder. And if you're unemployed and single and living at your parents' house, if you're 36 versus 21, you have certain things in common, even though you're a very different age. Now, maybe the 36-year-old now is in a more stigmatized category and is more ashamed of their status. But in some ways, they have something in common with the 21-year-old who's also living in their parents' basement. And so, the idea of fixing it around the birth year doesn't make sense at that point.
And are generations even official categories or entities? I mean, earlier I asked you about researchers that might use them, and you told me that there's not many researchers out there who use generation labels. It's mostly journalists and specific kinds of organizations out there. So are they considered official or?
It's funny. People say Officially, I'm a millennial, but I feel like I'm Generation Z or something. But no, they're not official categories, at least not in the US. And I'm not aware that they are anywhere else. Um, the baby boom was a demographic event, and that is which produced baby boomers in the sense of people who are part of those birth cohorts.
Yeah.
And I think that got us going in that way. But the subsequent categories have no official status. And that's actually why the group of researchers and I approached the Pew Research Center, because were clearly identifying the Pew categories as sort of the standard categories. And Pew had sort of an explainer website where they said, like, this is how we drew the lines here. And they had some vaguely empirical bases about September 11th or the internet or something like that. But they basically just said, we're going to use they said, we know they're basically arbitrary, but once you name them and you use them, they start carrying their own weight. So we're going to kind of use them in a consistent way, at least. And so Pew is very influential, and that was the closest we had. Gallup, another polling organization, also has been influential, but there's no official status to these. And if you think about how the milestones in life have changed, we lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. We raised the drinking age to 21. We have raised the retirement age is on a schedule to gradually rise in the U.S. with Social Security. So even to the extent that there are official markers, they vary over time as the population changes and the imperatives of those bureaucracies change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the other thing, because even when it comes to what we label as being adult in a particular society and in a particular time period varies across time and cultural context, right? That's just an example, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the US, we've had periods where people are very upset about teen pregnancy. Women being pregnant and having children, in their teen years. Well, that usually meant before 18, because 18 they're adults. And and if you look at teen pregnancy in the 1950s, they almost all got married between the pregnancy and the birth.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of people whose first birth was less than 9 months after their marriage at that time.
Yeah.
And people were not upset about teen births if the woman was married. So really the idea of the distress over the social problem of teen pregnancy and childbirth, which often is a problem, of course, and is often, it's not consensual, it's not planned, it has negative consequences, but it was really only in the context of not marriage, and specifically in a context where women had other opportunities. When we were upset about teen pregnancy and childbirth in the 80s and 90s was partly because women could go to college. And if they were having a child at age 17 or 18, their chance of going to college and having a successful, lucrative career was negatively impacted. If that was not the case, then you wouldn't necessarily be so upset about women having children at age 17. In some senses, biologically, it works pretty well. It's only a problem if it's not consensual, if it has negative consequences, if they don't have adequate social support, if it's not what they want, which is, often the case. But anyway, so these things change. That's all I'm saying. I can't remember the question.
So earlier we've touched a little bit on stereotypes. I mean, sometimes it's very unfortunate because even here in Portugal, even just recently, journalists did a few pieces on how supposedly people from Generation Z are lazier and they are more demanding in their jobs and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know if there's any specific research on this, but if there's those stereotypes circulating around, and particularly on mainstream media, couldn't it be the case that perhaps some of these people would even be discriminated when it comes to getting a job just because the employers have this sense that, oh, let's avoid employing people from Gen Z because they might, they might create problems in our company or something like that?
Yeah, so the stereotypes for young people interviewing today include they look at their phones during the job interview, they bring their parents to a job interview, they make unreasonable demands about things that they should be grateful for, like having a coffee machine in the office or something, snacks. And sort of this, right, this spoiled, privileged attitude, of course, very socioeconomically specific, but also quite wrong. Okay, but things have changed. So the law is different in different places. Age discrimination is a real thing. It's not necessarily illegal in all cases, but in some cases it is specifically illegal. And there was a little back and forth that I was played a small role in when our National Academy of Sciences did a study on the use of generation categories in employment decisions, hiring, and personnel management. And the idea was there were some people saying, and there's a whole industry of consultants basically who will tell employers, this is how you should deal with, kids these days. If you want to recruit the best talent and hire them, and how to treat them and how not to treat them. And it's a combination of, like a lot of business consulting, of stereotyping and certain kinds of insights. On the other hand, it can be very pernicious and harmful if you're applying stereotypes based on age or birth year without considering the realities of the person in front of you. So you have to have reasonable, if your workforce is all over age 60, you probably want to have make sure that you have adequate physical access for people who have trouble climbing stairs. Well, that may be but probably you should do that regardless of the age of your employees. But it may be like a sudden imperative if you had a big influx of older workers, right? So there's this back and forth where, we should do things universally. We should treat people equally and according to their own behavior and qualities and characteristics. But on the other hand, there are trends and patterns that we want to pay attention to. And that's a reasonable back and forth of thinking about how the world is changing and how we should respond. There are great advantages to what they call universal design with regard to disability. Everybody benefits from having alt text on an image on social media. A text that describes what the image is, because it helps machines read them, and it helps and people who are visually impaired. Everybody should have. All cities should have curb cuts on their curbs at street corners because it makes everybody's life easier and better, in addition to people who use wheelchairs. Okay, but the idea of rigidly attaching those to age categories is where it becomes harmful.
So now let me ask you this. What is supposed to come after the Z? Since now we are at Generation Z, and Z is the last letter of the alphabet. So what comes next?
I think people are already using alpha for what's next, unless that's alpha is also Z. No, I think alpha is supposed to be what's next. If we settled into a habit of arbitrary names like numbers or alphabet and fixed lengths, that wouldn't be the end of the world. But in that case, we may as well just use decades and call them decades. But I think what you will see, and you already see, is sort of a scramble for naming rights. The person who names them and has their name stick can become a popular consultant and sell books and get positive attention, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. So one thing that happens with that is, in the competition to name the next generation, they tend to get shorter, because one comparative advantage in that competition is to get your label to stick sooner. So you have to kind of roll it out quicker. So I think if they don't become standardized in some way, I think we'll see this continued pressure to shorten generations and come up with attractive names for them. I mean, millennial worked because it had to do with the millennium. It had to do with the changing with the year 2000. So there was sort of a logic to it. And after that, it was sort of like, oh, Z, we're done with this. But of course, we're not done with this. It's like an addiction. So they stick. And reasonable social scientists have made some progress on this. I think we have successfully stigmatized the use of the categories in serious research without empirical basis, in some quarters at least. But I don't really believe we're going to stop this practice. And, you know, in the long run, it's not that important. But as long as we just have to realize the possible downsides. So I don't know what they're going to be called next. Probably, you know, maybe somebody will think, oh, it should be reasonable. Let's just use alphabet letters. But nobody's going to want to be B. You know, if you have, you know, if generation A or alpha, beta just sounds terrible and nobody wants to be that. So I assume there will be, you know, there'll be something else will come along before generation alpha is even done and the alphabet thing won't stick.
But do you see a positive trend when it comes to how people use generation labels? I mean, do you see that, for example, as you and some of your other colleagues pointed to these issues, that some people at least are dropping the use of generation labels in their work or not?
Yes, I think so. I mean, if I looked at the occurrence of terms across in the social science literature, and it really is quite concentrated in business and psychology now, and business is really taking off. And so my knock on business research is it's often, you know, not serious research. It's sort of faddy. It has to do with you know, people trying to just generate attention for their consulting jobs. It's a total stereotype. It's completely unfair. So you know, I apologize. But it seems to be concentrated highly in business, which is interesting. And it, you know, it has to do a little bit with the way business researchers communicate, who they communicate with, and so on. But I'm happy that economists and sociologists and historians are not using these terms very much. And I do think there's also a recognition in the public, I think, of their arbitrariness. And that's why, you know, sometimes it seems like wasting effort. Like, oh, I'm a millennial, but I don't feel like a millennial. You could have just skipped both of those statements and moved on with your life 10 seconds earlier. But it is a way of framing. It's a way of putting yourself in historical context. And there's a, you know, the generation gap. I mean, interestingly, you know, these generations are getting shorter. Human generations are getting longer. And because of low birth rates, in some ways, the generations are getting closer together in that parents have fewer children, grandparents have fewer grandchildren, and their lives are longer. You know, a grandparent may now have a 70-year relationship with two grandchildren. You know, that's a very meaningful, I'm not 70 years, right? More like a 50-year relationship with two grandchildren. You know, that could develop into a very meaningful adult relationship over a long period of time and can actually draw generations closer together. Grandparents all have 25 grandchildren. They can't even remember all their names and they die when they're 60. Then it's a different kind of intergenerational relationship. So actually we have great potential for vertical generational relationships improving and deepening over historical time. And then with like slicing them all up into like in our family, we have there's no baby boomers in my family. My parents were born before the baby boom, and me and my sibling were born after the baby boom. There's no baby boomers and that's not so unusual. The generations are getting further apart. My parents were slightly older when they had their children than some other people. Like just the baby boom squeezed right into that moment for them. So I mean, we may just find that there are other ways to express our generational affinities and affiliations besides these categories, hopefully.
So let me just ask you one last question then. When it comes to your own work, we've already talked about throughout the interview demographic trends, but you also do work on family structure, the division of labor, health disparities. Do you see or think that generation labels have affected or could affect in any way research on those topics that you are interested in?
Well, they mostly, the labels mostly occur as noise, in the sense that you know, everything I do, I'm looking at like marriage or divorce rates over time. And so you know, the year of birth is a very important element in that. You know, people who get married at a young age are much more likely to get divorced. And people who get married in certain periods are more likely to get divorced. So you have to weigh those two factors, the age and the period, which together makes cohort. So we have to think about these things. If people collapse their data into categories without reason at the start of this, it becomes noise because you have to immediately ask, is this category working? Right. So like if I look at is it concealing very important variation? Am I splitting Venus and Serena Williams in a way that that undermines my ability to actually understand what was happening in the 1980s? So there's as soon as you start using the categories, you have to pull them apart and see if they make sense. And then maybe they do, maybe they don't, but it would just be random at that point. So it introduces noise and sort of aggravation without introducing any clarity. Now, like I said, if I use decades, that may have the same effect. So I may start with decades and then say, well, wait a second, let's actually be careful here because 2009 was a very big year. And so maybe I want to break these apart. So you may end up in a similar process, but you don't start with a name and a label and an assumption that it matters. You start with a recognition that you use some arbitrary categories for convenience, and then maybe check to make sure that you're not obscuring important variation when you do that. I imagine it's similar. I won't say anything about biology, but the identification of species is a big issue in biology. I'm aware, and it's not always so cut and dry. And you definitely don't want to assume your categories before you do the research. That's all.
Great. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh, sure. So my website is philipncohen.com. That's Philip with one L. So you can see everything there. I have a blog called Family Inequality. And if you look for the generations tag there, you'll see all the many rants and tirades I've written about generations on that subject and the other topics I work on. So I thank you. I hope people will visit.
Yeah, sure. I'm leaving some links to that in the description of the interview.
Okay.
And Philip, thank you so much again for doing this. It's been a fun conversation.
It really has. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles de Moray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.